Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Amazing Podcast. And we're happy that you joined. We hope you like the conversations here. And if you want to hear more like this, as I tell you every time, go over to our website, amazic.com. That's AMAZIC.com. We've got more than 2 years worth of conversations like this with many vendors, open source projects, and innovators in the space. So you'll really love catching up on all of those conversations we've been having. I'm Twain Taylor, editor at Amazic. And I have with me today Philippe Verloy, who is the field CTO at Rubrik, or specifically, he is the field CTO of Rubrik X, which he'll tell us a bit more about in just a bit. Philip, it's great to have you back for the second time on this podcast, and this time to talk to us about Rubrik. So tell us a bit about yourself and just how the past few months have been at Rubrik and what you do at Rubrik.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, thanks, Twain. So first of all, thanks for having me back. I enjoyed our previous conversation as well. So yeah, I recently returned to Rubrik after being at No Name Security for a while. But I originally started at Rubrik in 2016, so I was one of the first SEs for the EMEA region. And in fact, my role there was to sort of look after all of the regions where we didn't have a local sales team presence. So the role was even called Rest of Europe, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
So I traveled around quite a lot with our VP of EMEA, like opening up countries for Rubrik, talking to distributors, local partners, and so on to sort of get things going. I remember my first trip in 2016 was to go to South Africa. Like we didn't have any presence there, just to sort of do a bunch of events and start to talk to people. So that was really an exciting time. But that role sort of evolved to a field CTO role. So I was the first field CTO for Rubrik, which is like a very broad role. It's like a combination of, I would say, pre-sales, some marketing and events, C-level engagements, content creation, like a very, very broad role with, potentially a lot of impact. I did leave Rubrik at the end of 2021. As mentioned, I joined No Name Security, which is in the API security space, which is when we first spoke as well.
Yeah.
So API security, very, interesting space, often still a blind spot, I would say, in a lot of security programs. But I was enticed back to Rubrik to join Rubrik X, or RX for short. So Rubrik X is sort of the innovation/incubation team within the larger Rubrik organization. So the idea is we, bring early products and early solutions to market, try to figure out what's best for our customers. We look after some of the M&A activity that we're doing. For example, we recently acquired this company called Laminar Security in the summer of last year, which now is Rubrik Data Security Posture Management. So it's really about, how can we keep at the forefront of data security and how can we bring innovation to the broader Rubrik platform, but at the same time address real customer issues and customer problems. And that's I would say, one of the big reasons why I came back to Rubrik, that and to work with like the amazing Rubrik team as well. But yeah, happy to be back.
Wow, interesting journey there. You got to come back to Rubrik for a second stint. What's the focus of Rubrik? So you mentioned that DSPM is one of the things that the Laminar technology, that acquisition brought in. But broader than that, what does Rubrik focus on?
Yeah, so at Rubrik, if you look at the website and the goal on the website, we say it's to secure the world's data, which sounds like a big, like hairy goal, if you will, but that's really what we're trying to do. And the idea is we focus on enterprise data. So we help customers secure data both on premises, in the cloud, in SaaS, in edge locations. Initially, we did this through data management or modern backup and recovery, if you will. But over time, the platform expanded quite a bit, and there's more and more, data security capabilities built in now, things like threat monitoring, threat hunting, anomaly detection, and so on. If you look from a use case perspective, so obviously there's this idea of business continuity and disaster recovery, and making sure people can get their data back as quickly as possible. But at the same time, it also addresses a lot of the security issues that are prevalent today, like ransomware, obviously being the big one. So that's really the goal of Rubrik, is to make sure that a customer can focus on operations, day-to-day operations, and creating value, whilst Rubrik sort of safeguards their data, and then whatever happens in terms of data deletion, data corruption, encryption, data exfiltration, and so on, Rubrik will then have an answer so the customer can bounce back into production as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Wow. It's really cool that you get to do innovation at Rubrik and kind of work with the cutting edge technologies. So it'll be great to talk about some of those things that you're working on. I saw that there was this report that Rubrik had published recently called the Zero Labs report. Could you tell us a bit about that report and some of the key findings from it?
Yeah, sure. So next to Rubrik X, we have another part of Rubrik called Rubrik Zero Labs, which is a very interesting part of Rubrik. So they have a specific mission. So they're a bit more, even though they're a part of Rubrik, they're really vendor agnostic. So what they do is they want to deliver like actionable, as I said, vendor agnostic insights to reduce data risks. And one of the ways they do that is by publishing this Zero Labs report. So this is the fourth one that they've published so far. Basically, what they do is they take Rubrik telemetry data. So we have telemetry data from 6,000 plus customers, spanning about 42 exabytes of data, and we sort of look at data growth and how much sensitive data is in there, et cetera, et cetera. We combine that Rubrik telemetry with data from Rubrik partners. In this fourth report, it's Microsoft and Aon predominantly, but there's also contributions from Mandiant, Palo Alto's Unit 42, Proofpoint, and others. And then the other big part is there's a survey that's run by Wakefield Research. So they survey about 1,600 mostly C-level people at organizations, both IT operations and security, so both the CIO and the CISO org. And the sort of insights that come out of that survey, combined with our telemetry data, combined with the partner data, gives you this study that focuses on data and data risks. And then for this fourth one specifically, we looked at data risk in the cloud, data risk specifically for healthcare, and then also the ransomware threat still. So the report, I think, is 48 pages long, so it's quite extensive. But like in general terms, some of the findings or the things that we're seeing is that the cloud is targeted with more frequency and also more success than on-premises environments today.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a lot of blind spots in the cloud, making it more difficult to defend. So think about, I don't want to call them legacy necessarily, but think about existing security tooling that you're sort of now carrying into the cloud to try and protect your cloud data and your cloud workloads. And specifically what I mean by that is that if you look at the data in the cloud today, 70% of that data is object storage based. And the tools that were built for on-premises aren't necessarily built to, look inside of object-based storage and understand, user access patterns for that type of storage, etc. So that results in a blind spot essentially. And then for healthcare, one of the things we noticed is that healthcare obviously has to deal with a lot of sensitive data by its nature, right? So if you go to a healthcare provider, there's a lot of personal information that you sort of hand over, and they maybe they run a bunch of tests, et cetera, and all of that data is extremely sensitive. So they have more sensitive data than the average other organization, which makes them a more interesting target in a lot of cases, especially for data exfiltration. And then the third thing I think that we sort of spotted in this report is that, if you look back maybe half a year, 9 months ago, there was this consensus in the market that ransomware was sort of over its peak and there was going to be a ransomware decline, but that didn't happen, right? So in actual fact, what we saw in this report is that it grew 70% year over year. So ransomware, and especially ransomware 2.0 or data exfiltration, is really still a massive problem. As I said, the report is 48 pages long, a lot of findings in there. I think if I can, I'll pull out one specific stat, which I have on the screen in front of me. I didn't memorize all of them, but so if you look at, so this is based on the Wakefield research part, so the survey part. And what they saw is that 94% of the organizations experienced a cyber attack in last
If you
year.
want to share your screen, you could, though.
Say again?
If you want to share your screen and show that stat, you could.
Oh, yeah,
Or just
sure.
mention it.
Yep. Let me do that.
Yeah, by the way, for our listeners and viewers, definitely go check out this report. 48 pages of data that's, it seems like it's from real world use cases. There's 1,600 organizations being surveyed. There's a lot of telemetry data around all of Rubrik's customers. And so there's a lot of real data in that report. So definitely go and check it out. Yeah, Philip.
Yeah,
can see
so
it.
I'll just use this one data point. So again, this is coming from the Wakefield side. So what they did is they surveyed these 1,600 C-level people. What they saw is that 94%, so let's say almost all of them, reported a significant cyber attack last year. And what that meant is, of those 94%, the average frequency was 30 malicious events that they actually reported to senior leadership. So think about some of these events that they won't necessarily report to senior leadership, which are still a cyber incident, right? So it's 30 significant events essentially that they brought up to their senior organizational leadership. So that's a pretty astounding number. And then of those 94%, 93% of those had to conduct a formal data loss notification. So it's sensitive data or some sort of regulatory data that they then had to report to a governing body. And that sort of brings up the question, of course, how do you do that? So do you have the capabilities to understand what data was impacted, which customers potentially were impacted? So you have to report that. And then, because of the, depending in which country you're in, because of some tight regulations, the amount of time that you have to perform these initial notifications is quite narrow. So you have to sort of take that into account. But yeah, as you pointed out, a lot of additional interesting insights in this report, but this is like the one stat I think I wanted to bring up.
Wow. Those are some great findings that you had shared. So definitely go and check out this report. You can look up Rubrik Zero Labs report and you'll find it. I wanted to ask Philip about ransomware 2.0 that you just mentioned. Can you shed a little bit more light on how that's different or possibly more harmful than the previous versions of ransomware that we dealt with and what it means for data security?
Yeah, so what we saw initially is data encryption as a ransomware sort of use case or modus operandi, if you will. So the idea was somebody got access to your environment, was able to encrypt your data, and then they would hold you ransom for access to the decryption key, essentially, so you could get your data back. What we've seen now, and this is probably since the end of 2022 or so, is that there's an additional component to ransomware where there's data exfiltration. And that component of data exfiltration has become slowly more prevalent, meaning, in the beginning, some of these ransomware actors also perform data exfiltration, but now it's probably the biggest component of a ransomware attack is the exfiltration piece. The idea is that a ransomware actor now has twice the opportunity to hold you for ransom. Like if you have capabilities to restore your data, which was encrypted, they will still have a second chance because now they will potentially leak your sensitive data on the dark web. So customers tend to be a lot more open to paying a ransom when there is an exfiltration component involved. So one of the pieces in the Zero Labs report is a study from the University of Twente in the Netherlands, where they looked at how organizations are more or less likely to pay the ransom depending on the type of ransomware event. If it's just an encryption event, then 20%, I believe, top of my head, will think about paying that ransom. If there's an exfiltration component, it jumps to 40%. And then the other thing that they noticed is that the amount that companies are willing to pay or that malicious actors are asking for in a data exfiltration versus a data encryption event is 5.5 times higher if there's an exfiltration component involved. So that's why people have shifted to data exfiltration, because people are more likely to pay the ransom, and the ransom amount is also likely to be higher because there's no recovery from a data exfiltration event. Some people have capabilities to restore from an encryption event, but if the data is exfiltrated, you have to trust a criminal actually to hold their word, and if you pay the ransom, that they will destroy your data and not leak it, which is something that we've seen as well, right? So people who have paid the ransom after the data exfiltration still had their data leaked on the dark web after making the payment. So there's this weird trust that you have to gain with that malicious actor in that case.
Yeah, definitely not a situation anyone would want to be in. So when it comes to like data exfiltration, considering that is the main issue, what are the most common causes for it? What are the loopholes that the attackers use to exfiltrate data?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. So we've seen this shift as well in sort of types of attacks, if you will. I think malicious actors typically tend to go for the path of least resistance. So if there's a couple of options how they can get into your environment, let's say they would have to circumvent, a perimeter firewall to get into your environment, or they would have to find a 0-day that would give them access to your SSL VPN concentrator and allow you to log in that way, or they somehow have to break into an IoT device and laterally move from there in your IT environment and so on. That is not typically what we're seeing in most of these cases. What we're seeing in most of the cases are people get access to credentials because the most prevalent attack factor today is access credentials, like weak, leaked, and stolen passwords are typically the way that people get in, especially in the cloud, because once you have credentials, getting into a cloud environment is pretty straightforward. It's connected to the internet, it's connected to the public internet to some extent, right? So that's what people are looking for. And if you look at people simply leaving credentials in things like Pastebin or GitHub and so on. Maybe it's service credentials, but at least that's an initial way in. And then, maybe through getting a more relevant account, they can then do some lateral movement in the environment. So that's sort of what we're seeing, is that people are not breaking in, they're logging into environments. And once they've logged into your environment, it's fairly easy for them to then laterally move through the environment, encrypt your data, exfiltrate your data, and then make way with your most relevant business data, let's say. So that is sort of what we are noticing today. And protecting against that is pretty tricky. Like there's a lot of basic hygiene that people aren't necessarily implementing right now. So a couple of weeks ago, we had this big wave of Snowflake data exfiltration because people weren't implementing, multi-factor authentication, even on their sensitive data that they were exposing. So like basic security hygiene still is a problem, and that typically leads to a lot of incidents based on accounts being misused to log into environments. The other thing I would say is, next to people simply pasting some of these, maybe it's a non-human identity in a GitHub repository or something. If you look at how easy and cheap it is today to acquire credentials from any enterprise on the dark web, it's quite amazing. So there's people running these info stealer campaigns all of the time. They get a set of credentials of a certain well-known enterprise, and they sell it to you for, I don't know, between $10 and $40 for a set of credentials. And those credentials are extremely fresh in a lot of cases, meaning, because they get the data out of your browser, they contain your authentication information, but also potentially your authentication cookie. So they're not even prompted to log in through MFA at that point. So it becomes really, really easy for people with bad intentions to get access to these credentials and then get initial access to your environment. And that ultimately, I would say in most cases, leads to some sort of data impact. That's ultimately what these malicious actors are after, is either encrypting your data for ransom, exfiltrating your data for ransom, or just encrypting your data because they have some sort of political cause or something that they don't agree with. So, but that's typically what they're after.
That's crazy. Wow, scary to think that they can just take data from your browser through campaigns. Do you give us an example of a campaign that could be used like this?
I mean, there's like probably the most famous tool you can use is like the Redline Info Stealer. Like I think you can buy it now for $150 or something and just download it to your own machine and start using it. They even sell it as a service as well. So they have a nice help desk if you can't really figure out how to use it. So those things are readily available. What we see is that there's a lot of ransomware as a service organizations out there. So people outsource these ransomware activities to these RAS providers because they want to get data, let's say, of a well-known enterprise, but they don't necessarily want to do the heavy lifting themselves. So you have Logbit, you have Black Basta, you have Black Cat, Alfeed. So there's a lot of these malware or ransomware groups that are more than happy to provide these services for you. And then they typically go after these big names because that's what gives them sort of clout as well, right? So then they put up these big names on their leak websites, and then they become even more well known, and then people make more use of their services. So it's this continuous process which is in their benefit. One of the interesting things we saw was with Black Cat not too long ago. So in the US, there was this talk about having to, based on the new SEC regulations, having to report a data exfiltration event to the SEC. And then what they did is I won't name the organization specifically, but they exfiltrated a bunch of data of this organization, and then they waited for them to report to the SEC. And when the time to report expired, they saw that this organization hadn't reported it to the SEC. So what the ransomware group did is they reported it themselves. So they contacted the SEC and they said, look, we've exfiltrated data off of this well-known organization. Obviously, they haven't publicly reported it because we haven't seen anything, but this is what happens. So now they're sort of becoming very emboldened and very bold in their approach and like using this regulatory threat, if you will, to sort of, have another lever to go after organizations.
Wow, that's crazy. Wow, you've given us like a really detailed tour of, the dark web operations, and it's really fascinating how attackers are so sophisticated, and I think it's becoming more and more challenging to stay one step ahead of them. When you talk about credentials, do you mean login password, username, password, that kind of credential, or what's the split between that versus like the non-human credentials, like the API keys, access tokens, security certificates, those kind of machine identity, credentials? What's the split between the two?
Yeah, I don't know like a good split percentage top of my head, but I think it's interesting to see what's happening on the basis of how we changed our architectural patterns, right? So in the past, we had like a client server model, and like you had authentication from end users into like a centralized environment. And it was relatively straightforward to sort of secure that and to deal with ACLs on that level. What we've done now is we are distributing our environment more and more. So we have more and more machine-to-machine communication, and that all happens on the basis of non-human identities, service account, other types of credentials, API keys, and so on. And that is more opaque, right? It's more opaque for IT operations, but to some extent, it's also more opaque for security operators as well. And it's an interesting way for malicious actors to gain access to an environment, right? So if you have a human identity, maybe you have more awareness if that human identity gets breached and gets used for certain things, because that's sort of more obvious in your logging environment and in the way that you operate. With these non-human identities, it becomes a bit more tricky. So I think what you need to do, and that's also a focus of Rubrik DSPM, is you have to understand the link between identity and sensitive data on the backend, and sort of start to map out how do certain identities or certain roles expose data on the backend. So what is the sort of blast radius, if you will, if somebody gets a hold of this identity or this service account? Potentially, what is the impact on data on the backend, let's say. And then what you can do is you can then think about implementing this concept of least privilege also for accounts and identities, where you say, actually, does a developer need access to the full production database of the accounting department? The answer is probably no. So having that insight, you can then go back to whoever is responsible for things like AIM, and then they can sort of re-implement or right size, if you will, those permissions and those credentials, so you're not sort of overexposing yourself.
Got it. Yeah, it's nice that you segued into Rubrik's DSPM solution. Could you give us a walkthrough or demo of what that would look like, and probably show us some of the key places to look in the Rubrik dashboard to find issues, and this context that you mentioned, associating the identity with the data it protects and seeing the blast radius. If you can demo some of those ideas for us, it would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you see here is the DSPM portal. So the way it works is you, as an end user, connect your environments into the DSPM solution. The tool itself is autonomous and out of band, meaning there's no agent to install. It also doesn't push traffic over a proxy or anything like that. It leverages cloud native APIs and serverless functions to perform all these capabilities. So essentially what a customer needs to do is they need to onboard their cloud or SaaS accounts into this environment. And once they've done that, the first thing that we perform is a full asset inventory. So in security, it's still true that you can't secure what you can't see. So giving you visibility of all of the data assets across all of your cloud environments and your SaaS environments gives you that first initial insight into what is happening. So the tool finds all of these cloud assets, if you will, things like S3 buckets, Snowflake databases, SQL instances, SharePoint, OneDrive, etc., etc. And then it also automatically performs data classification. So we have our own data classification capability in the solution. We'll surface things like PII data, business-related data, HIPAA data, etc., etc. And we do that so you can make more informed decisions about how you want to protect that environment. So if I just take one example here, we spotted this S3 bucket. There's a bunch of sensitive data in there. So if I drill down into this bucket, what you see is there's a risk assessment. So what the system does is it looks at, let's say, security best practices for that specific cloud provider. So in this case, it will tell you you have an S3 bucket, but you don't have activity logging enabled. There's access from an external account with very broad permissions. There's also no encryption at rest enabled, etc., etc. And there's sensitive data in this bucket, which means that the risk to this specific data asset is critical. So that's just inside. We can go a step further as well. So we can actually go inside of the data asset, see the actual data inside. So in this case, for example, here I have a temp drive. You have this dump of a database where you see there's a lot of sensitive information. You can actually go to that file as well. We'll show you exactly what type of sensitive information is in there. We provide data context as well. So in this case, it's a SQL dump. So our context engine tells you about the actual data file itself. So in this case, it's a SQL dump, but it also forms employee records and customer records. We can, because it's structured data, we can even go inside that database inside of those tables. So if you want to sort of validate what type of information is in there, we can even bring that back as well. That's just inside. The second thing that it does is you define data security policy. So you tell us, this is how I want my data to be secured in my organization. And it doesn't then matter if it's Azure, GCP, AWS, etc. So you provide these policies that say, for example, I'm a GDPR relevant country. All of my PII data needs to be in an EU data center. If you see data being replicated in Azure outside of a GDPR EU country, then I need you to create an alert or an incident, for example. So those types of things you can implement. And then what it does is it continuously monitors for violations against those policies, and then they will show up here. So let's stick with the same example that has 3 buckets, for example. So here we can see it from a policy violation perspective, where we say there's public access from anonymous users, and there's sensitive data in that bucket. So that is a violation. You can see the violation details. So this shows you the sensitive data, but it also makes that alert actionable. The last thing that you want is another alert going to your SIEM or your SOC environment, etc., where you can't really do anything about it. So the tool also provides you remediation action. So in this case, this could be the new bucket policy that you can apply to deny public access to that sensitive data.
Very
And then
cool.
I'll show one quick last thing. So the system is much more capable than that as well. But because you mentioned the identity piece, let me just focus on that for 1 second. So you have the identity inventory. So what we do here is we map users, including group access and certain cloud roles that they can assume, even on a sort of just-in-time basis. And then what we do is we map out assigned permissions to actual permissions. So in this case, we took this person called Matthew Johnson. We understand his job title based on pulling it out of the IAM. We understand what he has access to, and then here we can map out. So this is Matthew Johnson. He has read-write permissions across 3 cloud accounts, giving him access to all of this data on the backend. So by having this insight, you can then resize this or implement, let's say, least privilege access. So if somebody gets access to this Matthew Johnson account, the potential impact is minimized as much as possible.
Wow. Really cool demo. I loved 2 things, I think 3 things probably, but I love the data types because it really tells you I like those labels, very quickly it tells you at a top level what kind of data is in there and at risk. Also liked the remediation. That's really useful because it's got like the exact new policy that you should use. That's really helpful. And I like this visualization that you just showed as well, just the blast radius of each person. So it's really, it's probably like you can really geek out on this if you're into data security. And, there's a lot to play around with and like kind of go through everything with a magnifying glass, or even at a top level, it gives you both. So really, really good stuff. Yeah, it was a really nice demo. Yeah, so I want to ask about as we wind down, It looks really cool, just things you showed. But recently, I think AI has been making waves. And I want to ask you if, is that part of your roadmap as well? Are you like, do you guys have your eye on AI? Have you integrated that in any way, or do you plan to in the coming months or years?
Yeah, so definitely an interesting an interesting topic. So if you look at the DSPM solution specifically, so the demo that I just saw, we didn't really go into what we call data detection and response, so DDR. So the idea of DDR is really we can integrate, let's say, with server logging events and things like CloudTrail, et cetera, in the public cloud to get a real-time understanding of how people are using your data and where data access is coming from. So what we can do is we can sort of build a baseline understanding of how data is supposed to be used in your organization. And then DDR sort of lets us respond to anomalous behavior, right? So all of a sudden, we see somebody from a location that has nothing to do with your organization, like you don't have a traveling salesman there, or you don't have like a local entity there, logging into your environment and all of a sudden start to read, let's say, sensitive data out of a database. Things like that would constitute anomalous behavior. And we could then respond to that and say, this is not what we were expecting. We push that down to your SOC, and they can then sort of, investigate or remove access or block access or whatever needs to happen. So that's sort of one way from the DSPM angle. DSPM itself also has a big relevance for Gen AI in general as well. So if you think about building generative AI applications in an enterprise environment, you're doing that on the basis of data, right? So there's no Gen AI without data. And the problem with enterprise data is there's a lot of sensitive information in there that you don't necessarily want to be part of your model, let's say. So what the SPM can do is it can help you before you build your model to sort of filter out any data that you do not want to be part of the data training sets that you're going to use to build your LLM, let's say. It can also monitor for access to sensitive data environments to make sure nothing is happening on that end. If you build your model and somebody takes your model and starts hosting it in a cloud environment, for example, connected to a cloud VM, the SPM can also see that, right? So it can also alert on that and say, look, somebody is using, maybe it's a tester or a developer, is using this model in an outside environment, let's say. So those kind of things the SPM can be relevant for as well. But also think about, maybe you want to fine tune your model. You need enterprise data for that. Maybe you want to do things like retrieval augmented generation. You need external data for that. All of that data needs to be filtered and needs to be clean, quote unquote, before you actually want to use that in that enterprise setting. Because the last thing that you want is you don't want to overexpose data or leak sensitive data on the basis of an LLM application, let's say. So that's more for people who are building these Gen AI tools. We are also using Gen AI within the Rubrik platform as well. So we haven't really talked about the let's say traditional Rubrik platform, which is more focused on data management. The idea there is we have a tool called Ruby. So Ruby is our generative AI chatbot or assistant. And what Ruby helps you do is, let's say there's an attack on your environment, an encryption, a ransomware event. The idea is that stress levels will be high. People will be scrambling, trying to figure out how can we get operational as quickly as possible. What do we need to restore? What happened? Which data is safe to restore, etc. What Ruby does is it allows you to build a workflow using this conversational chatbot to help guide you through this recovery process to make sure you're sort of getting back as quickly as possible, and in the meantime you're not sort of shooting yourself in the foot, so to speak. So you can ask it things like, show me the data that was impacted, which version of the data should I bring back, so which version of the data did not contain this piece of malware that kicked off this ransomware event, for example. help build a recovery plan for me. So Ruby will guide you through that and make sure that you're back in production as quickly as possible without necessarily needing to be a Rubrik expert to do any of that. So there's a lot of angles where we are both relevant for people building Gen AI applications, but we are obviously also using AI and to some extent Gen AI tools ourselves as well.
Wow, that's really cool. Is Ruby already live or still still being developed?
Yeah, it is live. So there's a bunch of workflows that are already supported through Ruby. What we're doing is we're adding more and more of these capabilities in Ruby over time. But yeah, if you're an existing Rubrik customer, you can absolutely use Ruby today.
Okay, wow, exciting. Maybe next time you should join us and give us a demo of Ruby.
Yeah, I would love to do that. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. We have a lot to talk about. So yeah, if you have me back, I'll gladly show you Ruby as well.
All right. Yeah, with that, we come to the end of this conversation. It was a fascinating discussion about data security, some of the key threats like ransomware 2.0 and data exfiltration, the risks of that. And we had a great demo and walkthrough of the Rubrik dashboard where we saw a bunch of its capabilities that look really impressive. And finally, we winded down talking about AI, about how Rubrik can help organizations that are building AI models and bots, and also how Rubrik itself is using AI in its own platform to assist with disaster recovery or incident management, and those kind of situations. A really fascinating conversation this was. I hope you enjoyed it. Philip, before you go though, just one question that I want to ask was, you work with data security day in and day out. Are there any lessons or, ideas from your work with data security that are kind of rubbed off into real life, into your daily life? Uh, Anything on those lines? A kind of lesson you could learn from DSPM that applies to day-to-day life?
Yeah, I've probably become a lot more paranoid since I've been in security. That's for sure. So yeah, I think from a personal perspective, there's a lot of things we can do to sort of safeguard our data and thereby ourselves, right? So if you think about ransomware and how ransomware is evolving, what we're seeing now is people getting PII data out of an enterprise and using that PII data against individuals in some cases. Like even there's like swatting, for example, where people, they know where you live, they know your phone number, they call up the SWAT team or the police department, they make up a story and they send them to your home to sort of create this chaos almost in your life. So it's getting, it's having real personal implications and really bad personal implications. But yeah, I think some of the data security things that have sort of rubbed on off on me personally is like I'm really paranoid about like what data I share and what tools I use on my personal device versus my corporate device and so on. So I think there's this great overview of Microsoft of sort of the basic security hygienes. So I think that's something we all need to keep in mind is that we can actually do quite a lot ourselves to safeguard our personal life and not become a victim of these horrible things. So yeah, it's made me a bit more paranoid, but it's also made me implement a bunch of, I would say, security best practices in my personal environment, which I also bother my family with all of the time. But yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, good to know. Yeah, it's good to be aware and take those precautions. That's definitely the way to go. All right, Philip, thanks so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of our listeners and viewers for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next one.